The child locks. He activated the child locks. Those were the words Victoria Sterling whispered as smoke filled her luxury Mercedes and flames began consuming the car from underneath. 8 months pregnant, trapped on a remote mountain road, she watched her husband's Range Rover disappear around the bend, leaving her to burn alive. But this wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder, orchestrated by the billionaire she had trusted with her heart, her future, and her unborn child's life. What Victoria discovered next would shock you. The $10 million life insurance policy she never signed, the secret recordings of her husband planning her death, the elaborate web of financial fraud that made her both victim and unwitting owner of a criminal empire. But here's what her husband didn't count on. Victoria Sterling wasn't going to die quietly. And when a woman with nothing left to lose discovers she's actually been made the legal owner of everything her would-be killer built well, that's when the real story begins. This is the 90-minute journey of how a trapped wife became a Fortune 500 CEO, how a burning car became the catalyst for justice, and how the man who tried to erase her existence ended up making her one of the most powerful women in California. You're about to hear a story of survival, revenge, and transformation that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about marriage, money, and the deadly lengths some people will go to for both. Stay with me for the next hour and a half, because Victoria's escape from that burning car was just the beginning. The Mercedes engine sputtered like an old man's dying breath, coughed once, twice, then fell silent on the empty mountain road overlooking Malibu. The child locks. He activated the child locks. Victoria Sterling's voice cut through the acrid smoke now filling the luxury sedan's interior. Her 8-month pregnant belly pressed uncomfortably against the steering wheel as she frantically pulled at the door handle. The chrome mechanism moved uselessly under her grip, but the door remained sealed tight. The electronic locks wouldn't budge. Not the driver's side, not the passenger side. The back doors were similarly trapped, their safety mechanisms turned into a death sentence. Panic flooded her system like ice water. Victoria Sterling, 32 years old, former marketing executive turned Beverly Hills housewife, was trapped inside a car that was beginning to burn beneath her. The smell hit her nostrils first. Gasoline, sharp and chemical, so strong it made her eyes water and her throat close. Then came the heat, rising from beneath the vehicle like breath from hell itself. Metal groaned and popped as flames licked at the undercarriage, orange tongues of destruction reaching upward toward the fuel tank. Through the windshield, she could see Bradford's Range Rover disappearing around the mountain's bend, its red taillights fading into the California dusk like dying stars. Her husband of 5 years, the father of her unborn child, the man who had promised to love and protect her until death do them part. He had left her here to burn alive. Victoria's phone lay on the passenger seat, its screen reflecting her terrified face before displaying the crushing reality: no signal bars. They were too high in the mountains, too far from civilization. The remote stretch of Mulholland Drive that Brad had chosen for their romantic sunset drive was miles from the nearest house, the nearest person, the nearest hope of rescue. No signal, no signal, no signal. She checked the phone again, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the device. The screen showed the same mocking emptiness. No bars, no connection, no way to call for help as the car that had cost more than most people's houses became her crematorium. The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping through the air conditioning vents despite the system running at full blast. Each breath burned her lungs and made her baby kick frantically against her ribs, as if the child could sense the mortal danger they were both in. "This can't be happening," Victoria whispered, her voice lost in the growing roar of flames beneath her feet. "This can't be real." But the heat was real. The smoke was real. The mechanical click of the child safety locks that Bradford had activated before climbing out and walking calmly to his own vehicle was devastatingly real. Her husband had tried to murder her. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Victoria felt a surge of maternal fury that cut through her panic like a blade. She would not die here. Her daughter would not die here. Not for Bradford's money, not for his debts, not for whatever sick game he was playing with their lives. The passenger side window. It was her only chance. Victoria twisted awkwardly in her seat, her pregnant belly making every movement a struggle. The leather seats were getting warm now, too warm, and she could hear the ominous crackling of flames spreading beneath the luxury vehicle. The smell of burning plastic and melting rubber joined the gasoline fumes, creating a toxic cocktail that made her dizzy. She pulled off her designer pump, a $300 Jimmy Choo heel that Bradford had bought her for their anniversary last year, back when she thought he loved her. Back when she believed his gifts came from affection rather than guilt. The first blow against the window did nothing. Tempered glass was designed to withstand impact, to protect passengers in accidents. It wasn't designed to be broken from the inside by a desperate pregnant woman using a shoe as a weapon. The second hit created a spiderweb of cracks across the surface, silver fractures spreading like lightning through the dark glass. Victoria could feel sweat beading on her forehead, mixing with tears she didn't remember shedding. The air inside the car was getting hotter, thicker, harder to breathe. On the third swing, the window exploded outward in a shower of glass fragments that caught the dying light like deadly confetti. Sharp shards cut her forearms as she cleared the opening, warm blood mixing with perspiration as she fought her way through the jagged frame. Her silk maternity dress, another expensive gift from her loving husband, tore on the broken glass as she maneuvered her body through the window. The baby pressed against her lungs, making every breath a struggle, every movement an exercise in endurance. Victoria's feet hit the asphalt just as flames erupted around the rear tires in a whoosh of superheated air. The Mercedes was fully engulfed now, orange and red fire dancing across its once pristine surface, like demons celebrating a successful hunt. She stumbled away from the inferno, her designer heels slipping on the rough mountain road. That's when she saw them. Dark stains on the pavement, wet patches that caught the firelight and reflected it back like black mirrors. Someone had poured gasoline around the car in a deliberate pattern, creating an accelerant trail designed to ensure complete destruction. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This wasn't bad luck or faulty wiring or any of the innocent explanations that would undoubtedly be offered later. This was premeditated attempted murder, planned and executed by the man she had trusted with her life, her love, and her future. A sharp pain tore through Victoria's abdomen, doubling her over on the empty road. Contractions. The trauma and stress were sending her into premature labor, her body trying to expel the baby 8 weeks before her due date. "Not now," she pleaded with her own physiology, pressing both hands to her swollen belly. "Please, sweetheart, not now. We have to survive this first." The baby seemed to understand, the painful tightening in her uterus easing slightly. But Victoria knew it was only temporary. The stress hormones flooding her system, the smoke inhalation, the sheer terror of what had just happened, all of it was taking its toll on both mother and child. The Mercedes exploded behind her with a sound like thunder, a percussion wave that knocked her forward onto her hands and knees. Heat washed over her back as burning debris scattered across the road, fragments of her former life raining down like meteorites. She crawled away from the wreckage, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. Her knees scraped against the rough asphalt, adding new injuries to her growing collection. But she kept moving, driven by an instinct older than civilization: survive, protect, endure. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger as they approached. A battered pickup truck slowed, then stopped, its driver staring in shock at the burning luxury car and the pregnant woman bleeding on the road beside it. The man who climbed out was middle-aged, wearing work clothes stained with honest labor. His face was kind but bewildered, struggling to process the scene before him. "Jesus Christ, lady, are you okay? What happened here?" He was already reaching for his phone, fingers moving toward 911 before Victoria could answer. "I'll get you help right now." Victoria tried to speak, tried to explain, but another contraction seized her body and stole her breath. Through the pain, one thought echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. Bradford had activated the child locks. He had trapped her inside that burning car and driven away without looking back. Her husband, the father of her unborn child, had attempted to murder them both for money, the man she had loved for 5 years, the man she had married in a fairy tale wedding at the Beverly Hills Hotel, the man who had whispered sweet promises about their future together. That man had just tried to burn her alive. As sirens wailed in the distance and the Good Samaritan held her hand while she fought against premature labor, Victoria Sterling made a promise to herself and her unborn daughter. She would survive this. She would uncover the truth. And she would make Bradford Sterling pay for what he had tried to do to them. The fire continued to burn behind them, consuming the last remnants of her old life. But Victoria Sterling was already planning her new one, a life where she was no longer a victim, but a survivor with a score to settle. The emergency room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and fear, a combination that Victoria Sterling was beginning to associate with the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about her life. She lay on the hospital bed, monitoring equipment beeping steadily around her, as Dr. Sarah Campbell checked her vitals for what felt like the 100th time in 2 hours. "Your blood pressure is still elevated, but it's coming down slowly," Dr. Campbell said, her voice professionally calm despite the dramatic circumstances of Victoria's arrival. "We've managed to stop the contractions with the tocolytic medication. Your baby appears to be stable for now, but we'll need to monitor you both closely for the next 24 hours. Victoria's arms were wrapped in pristine white bandages that covered the glass cuts from her escape. Small patches of gauze dotted with seeping red, like abstract art painted in blood and terror. Her throat felt raw from smoke inhalation, each breath a reminder of how close she had come to suffocating in that burning Mercedes. But she was alive. They were both alive, and that meant she had a chance to figure out why her husband had tried to kill her. The door to her hospital room burst open with theatrical timing, and Bradford Sterling rushed in like a man possessed by grief and concern. His expensive Armani suit was perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle or stain to suggest he had spent the evening anywhere near burning cars or medical emergencies. His salt and pepper hair was styled with his usual precision, and his cologne still carried that subtle scent of bergamot and cedar that had once made her feel safe in his arms. Now it made her want to vomit. "Thank God you're alive, sweetheart," Brad said, his voice breaking in precisely the right places as he moved to her bedside. He took her uninjured hand in both of his, and Victoria marveled at how steady his fingers were. No trembling, no nervousness, no sign of the adrenaline that should have been coursing through a man whose pregnant wife had just barely escaped death. "The car just burst into flames out of nowhere," he continued, his brown eyes filled with what looked like genuine anguish. "I thought I'd lost you both. I thought I'd lost everything that matters to me." Even through her pain and confusion, Victoria found herself studying his performance with the analytical eye she had once brought to marketing campaigns. Bradford Sterling was selling a story, and he was selling it with the skill of a master manipulator. The concerned husband, the devoted father-to-be, the successful businessman brought low by the near loss of his family. If she hadn't been the one trapped inside that burning car, if she hadn't felt the child locks refusing to budge under her desperate hands, she might have believed him herself. "Where did you go, Brad?" Victoria asked quietly, testing the waters of his narrative. "To get help, darling. You know how bad cell reception is up on Mulholland Drive." His thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture she had once found comforting. "My phone had no signal either, so I drove to the ranger station as fast as I could. By the time I got back with the fire department, you were already in the ambulance." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. Victoria wondered how many times he had rehearsed this story, how many contingencies he had planned for. Had he expected her to die in the fire, making this performance unnecessary? Or had he always known there was a chance she might survive, requiring him to perfect his role as the grieving husband doctor? Campbell looked up from her medical chart, her professional demeanor masking whatever personal thoughts she might have about the situation. "Mr. Sterling, your wife has been through significant trauma tonight. Smoke inhalation, lacerations, and the stress of the situation triggered premature contractions. She needs rest and calm to prevent further complications." "Of course, doctor. Whatever she needs." Brad's grip on Victoria's hand tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle message that only she would understand. "But I have to ask, could this kind of trauma have affected her mentally? I know pregnancy hormones can be unpredictable, and an experience like this might cause confusion or even paranoid delusions." Victoria felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, like swallowing a piece of ice. He was already setting the narrative, already preparing the groundwork for discrediting anything she might say about what had really happened on that mountain road. "I'm not delusional, Bradford," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I know exactly what happened tonight." "Of course you do, sweetheart. But smoke inhalation can affect memory and perception. You might remember things differently than they actually occurred. Brad leaned down and kissed her forehead, the gesture so tender that any observer would see only a loving husband comforting his traumatized wife. The important thing is that you're safe now. We're going to get through this together. But Victoria had heard the message beneath his words. If she tried to tell anyone what had really happened about the child locks, about his deliberate abandonment, about the gasoline stains on the road, he would claim she was suffering from pregnancy-induced psychosis. Who would believe the traumatized woman over the successful businessman with no history of violence? After Dr. Campbell left to check on other patients, Victoria was alone with her attempted murderer. Brad settled into the bedside chair as if preparing for a long vigil, playing his part to perfection. "I was so scared," he murmured, his voice pitched just loud enough for any passing nurse to overhear. "When I saw those flames, when I realized you were trapped inside, Victoria, I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost you." The way she tested the door handle had become reflexive now, this need to confirm she wasn't trapped again. Even in her hospital bed, Victoria found herself reaching toward the bathroom door, checking that it would open freely under her touch. Not locked, not sealed, not a prison designed to contain her while someone else decided her fate. The gesture was unconscious, born of trauma and terror, but it gave her a moment to think. Bradford was here now, playing his role. But what had he been doing during the hour between her escape and his arrival at the hospital? What loose ends had he been tying up? What evidence had he been destroying? "I know what I saw, Brad," Victoria said quietly, meeting his eyes directly. "He activated those locks. I'm not crazy." The words were meant for herself as much as for him, a validation whisper against the gaslighting campaign that was already beginning. Whatever game Bradford was playing, whatever story he was crafting, she would not let him rewrite her memory or her reality. Brad's expression remained concerned and loving, but Victoria caught something else flickering behind his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or irritation that his carefully constructed narrative wasn't being accepted without question. "Darling, you've been through something terrible. It's natural for your mind to try to make sense of a senseless accident, but sometimes trauma can make us see patterns that aren't really there, assign blame when there's no one to blame." Detective James Morrison arrived an hour later, his tired face and rumpled suit suggesting he had been dragged away from his dinner to deal with another Beverly Hills crisis. He was a man in his early 40s with intelligent eyes and the weary patience of someone who had seen too much human nature to be easily fooled. But even Detective Morrison's questions felt more like accusations than inquiries. Why had Victoria been driving Bradford's car instead of her own? Had they been arguing before the incident? Was she experiencing any mental health issues related to her pregnancy or their marriage? The doors were locked. "Detective," Victoria told him, trying to keep her voice steady and credible. "Bradford activated the child safety locks before he left the car. I couldn't get out." Detective Morrison wrote something in his notepad, but his expression remained skeptical. "Child locks are activated by a switch inside the vehicle." "Ma'am, are you saying your husband got out of the car, walked around to your side, activated the locks from inside your door panel, then somehow exited again and got into his own vehicle?" When Morrison laid it out like that, it did sound impossible. Victoria realized with growing horror that Bradford had been more clever than she had initially understood. The child safety locks could only be activated from inside the car. But there were ways to do it. Electronic override systems, smartphone apps that controlled luxury vehicle features, remote access protocols that came with high-end cars. But explaining that to the detective would make her sound exactly like the paranoid, delusional woman that Bradford was already painting her to be. "I know it sounds impossible," Victoria said, "but I know what I experienced. I know what happened to me." "Trauma can be very confusing, ma'am," Detective Morrison said gently, his tone suggesting he was trying to be kind to a woman whose grip on reality had been shaken by a terrible accident. "Smoke inhalation, panic, pregnancy stress. Sometimes our minds fill in details that make sense to us at the time, even if they aren't exactly what happened." Bradford squeezed her hand supportively, the picture of a devoted husband standing by his wife during her mental health crisis. "Detective, is there anything else you need from us tonight? Victoria needs her rest." After Morrison left, Taking his skepticism and his notepad with him, Victoria was alone again with the man who had tried to kill her. The hospital room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing closer as Bradford settled back into his vigil. "You should try to get some sleep," he suggested, his voice warm with false concern. "Tomorrow we'll start dealing with the insurance claims, replacing the car, all the practical matters. But tonight, just focus on healing." Victoria closed her eyes and pretended to drift off, but her mind was racing. While she had been unconscious from smoke inhalation and medication, Bradford had been busy. She could feel it in the air between them, sense it in his too-perfect confidence. When she was certain he believed she was sleeping, Victoria carefully reached for her phone on the bedside table. The familiar weight of the device in her hands should have been comforting, a connection to her contacts and her digital life. Instead, what she found was devastating. The phone screen lit up normally, but everything was wrong. Her photo gallery, which should have contained thousands of pictures documenting 5 years of marriage, was completely empty. Her contact list showed only a handful of numbers: emergency services, her doctor, Bradford's office. All her text message conversations had vanished, leaving behind a sterile emptiness that erased entire relationships from her digital existence. Her email accounts had been wiped clean. Her social media apps required her to log in again, as if she were a stranger trying to access someone else's life. Even her Notes app, where she kept everything from grocery lists to gift ideas for Bradford's business associates, showed nothing but blank white space. The phone had been completely restored to factory settings while she lay unconscious in the emergency room. Bradford had been busy indeed, but the violation went deeper than simple data deletion. Her cloud storage accounts had been changed, the passwords reset, her backup files were gone. 5 years of digital memories, carefully curated and preserved, had been systematically destroyed. It was the act of someone who was not just covering his tracks, but erasing evidence of his victim's entire existence. Victoria carefully placed the phone back on the bedside table and continued feigning sleep, but her heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and rage. Bradford wasn't just trying to kill her body. He was trying to kill her identity, her connections, her proof that she had ever been anything more than the delusional woman he was portraying to the world. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ryan Blackwood entered, introducing himself as a representative from Pacific Mutual Insurance. He was a thin man in a cheap suit, with the careful manner of someone who spent his days investigating other people's worst moments. "I'm sorry to bother you after such a traumatic experience, Mrs. Sterling," Blackwood said, consulting a tablet computer. "I just need to ask a few questions about the insurance policies involved in tonight's incident." "What policies?" Victoria asked, genuinely confused. Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your life insurance policy, ma'am. Pacific Mutual recently became the carrier for a very substantial policy on your life. $10 million to be precise." Victoria felt the room tilt around her. "I never applied for any life insurance policy. According to our records, the policy was initiated 6 months ago with a full medical examination and psychological evaluation. Your signature is on all the documents." Blackwood swiped through screens on his tablet. "The beneficiary is your husband, naturally. Quite a substantial payout for someone your age." But Victoria had never taken any medical examination. She had never signed any insurance documents. She had never agreed to a $10 million policy on her life. The only medical appointments she had kept in the past 6 months were routine prenatal visits with Dr. Campbell. "I need to see those documents," Victoria said, but Blackwood was already putting away his tablet. "I'm sure your husband can provide you with copies when you're feeling better. The important thing right now is your recovery." He paused at the door. "Though I should mention, Mrs. Sterling, that policies of this size always require thorough investigation when claims are filed. We'll need to verify every detail of tonight's incident." After he left, Victoria lay in the dark hospital room and tried to process what she had learned. Bradford had not only attempted to murder her, he had been planning it for months. The $10 million life insurance policy, the complete destruction of her digital life, the careful preparation of his alibi and his narrative about her mental instability. This wasn't a crime of passion or a desperate response to financial pressure. This was a methodical, calculated campaign to destroy her and profit from her death. But Bradford had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated her. Victoria Sterling had survived the burning car, and she was going to survive whatever came next. More than that, she was going to fight back. The validation whisper came from somewhere deep inside, a voice that refused to be silenced by doubt or manipulation. I know what I saw. He activated those locks. I'm not crazy. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't suffering from pregnancy-induced psychosis or trauma-related paranoia. She was a woman who had discovered that her husband was trying to kill her, and she was going to prove it. Victoria was released from Cedars-Sinai the following afternoon, her discharge papers rustling in her bandaged hands as Bradford helped her into the passenger seat of his Range Rover. The same vehicle she had watched disappearing around the mountain road as flames consumed her prison. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now completely dependent on her would-be killer for transportation, shelter, and protection. Bradford had orchestrated the situation perfectly. Who would question a devoted husband caring for his traumatized pregnant wife? The drive from Beverly Hills to their Malibu estate took 40 minutes through the twisted canyon roads that Victoria had once found scenic and peaceful. Now every curve felt like a potential ambush site. Every isolated stretch a place where accidents could happen to women who knew too much about their husband's business dealings. Bradford drove with his usual confidence, one hand on the steering wheel, classical music playing softly from the premium sound system. Mozart's Piano Concerto, number 21, filled the silence between them, the same piece that had played during their wedding reception 5 years ago. Another calculated touch, Victoria realized, designed to evoke memories of happier times when she had trusted him completely. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. "Any contractions, dizziness? The doctor said to watch for signs of delayed shock." "I'm fine," Victoria replied, though fine was the last word she would use to describe her current state. She was trapped in a car with a man who had tried to murder her, being driven to a house where she would be completely isolated with him, carrying his child and dependent on his mercy for her survival. But admitting fear or vulnerability would only give Bradford more ammunition for his narrative about her mental instability. So she sat quietly and planned, her mind working through possibilities and contingencies while her hands rested protectively over her 8-month belly. Their Spanish-style mansion appeared around the final curve like something from a dream, all red tile roofs and pristine landscaping overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Victoria had fallen in love with the house the moment she first saw it, back when she believed she was marrying her soulmate rather than her potential executioner. The circular driveway was crowded with unmarked sedans and official-looking vehicles. "Insurance investigators," Bradford explained as he helped her from the car, his hand solicitous on her elbow. "Just a formality. The Mercedes had been expensive, and these things required thorough documentation." "Nothing for you to worry about," he assured her as they walked toward the front entrance. "I'll handle all the paperwork and questions. You just focus on resting and taking care of our baby." "Our baby." The possessive pronoun sent a chill down Victoria's spine. Bradford was already talking about their daughter, as if Victoria were merely the vessel carrying his heir, not a person with rights and agency of her own. Inside the house, Victoria climbed the curved marble staircase to the second floor, each step an effort that reminded her of her injured state. The investigators' voices drifted up from Bradford's study, professional discussions of accelerant patterns and vehicle electronics that she was apparently too fragile to hear. The nursery drew her like a magnet. The room had been her sanctuary during the past few months of pregnancy, a place where she could imagine the future she was building with Bradford. Now it felt like a monument to her naivety. The walls were painted in soft yellow, carefully gender-neutral, with a white crib and matching furniture arranged around a comfortable gliding chair. Tiny clothes hung in precise organization in the walk-in closet. Newborn sizes progressing to 3 months, 6 months, planning for a future that someone had tried to steal from her the night before. Victoria settled into the gliding chair and picked up a onesie from the basket beside it, running her fingers over the soft cotton fabric. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant murmur of voices from downstairs. She folded the onesie carefully and placed it back in the basket. Then she folded it again. The repetitive motion helped her think, gave her hands something to do while her mind processed the magnitude of what had happened to her. Bradford had been different lately, she realized now. working longer hours, taking more phone calls behind closed doors, displaying subtle signs of stress that she had attributed to normal business pressures. Sterling Enterprises was a major real estate development company with projects throughout California, and Victoria had assumed his preoccupation was related to construction delays or permit issues. But what if it wasn't business stress? What if Bradford had been planning her murder for months, orchestrating the complex web of insurance policies and alibis and evidence destruction that would allow him to kill her and profit from her death? A soft knock on the nursery door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor Hartwell stood in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early afternoon hour. At 58, Eleanor commanded respect in courtrooms throughout Los Angeles. But to Victoria, she would always be the woman who had helped her navigate her father's death 2 years ago. Eleanor had been Robert Chen's attorney when he sold his software company for $50 million just months before his death from pancreatic cancer. She had structured the trust that protected Victoria's inheritance, ensured that the money would remain secure regardless of any future marriage or divorce, or so Victoria had believed. "Your father made me promise to protect you, Victoria," Eleanor said, closing the nursery door behind her with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. "Something's not right here." Eleanor took the chair opposite Victoria, her expression grave. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Bradford has been avoiding my calls, claiming you're too busy with pregnancy preparations to discuss business matters." "What kind of business matters?" Eleanor opened a manila folder she had been carrying, revealing documents that made Victoria's blood run cold. "Your trust fund, the inheritance from your father's company sale. Bradford has been making requests to modify the terms." Victoria's father had been methodical about protecting his daughter's future. The $50 million from his company sale had been placed in an irrevocable trust with Victoria as the sole beneficiary, managed by Eleanor's law firm. The structure was designed to be bulletproof, protected from creditors, divorce settlements, and manipulative spouses, or it should have been. "What kind of modifications?" Victoria asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "He wants to change the beneficiary structure," Eleanor explained, spreading documents across the small table between them. "Make himself co-trustee with full access to the principal. He's been pushing for months, claiming it's necessary for tax optimization and estate planning. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible in my own marriage." The realization hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. She had been so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect mother-to-be, the perfect trophy for Bradford's successful lifestyle, that she had stopped paying attention to the details of her own financial life. When was the last time she had reviewed a bank statement, examined their insurance policies, checked the terms of the trust that was supposed to ensure her independence? She had delegated all of that to Bradford, trusting him to manage their finances while she focused on pregnancy and home decoration and the thousand small details of upper-class domestic life. "There's more," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the grim tone Victoria remembered from her father's final days. "I had my investigator run a preliminary background check on Sterling Enterprises. Victoria, the company is in serious financial trouble." Eleanor opened another section of the folder, revealing bank statements, loan documents, and legal filings that painted a devastating picture. Sterling Enterprises was hemorrhaging money, behind on payments to multiple creditors, facing lawsuits from contractors and investors. "They owe over $30 million to various lenders," Eleanor explained, pointing to highlighted figures that seemed to dance before Victoria's eyes. "The company is essentially bankrupt, surviving only through increasingly desperate borrowing against future projects that may never materialize. $30 million in debt, a $10 million life insurance policy, a trust fund worth $50 million that Bradford was trying to access." The mathematics of murder laid out in black and white across the nursery floor. "He needs money fast," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And there are only 2 ways he can get it." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Access your trust fund, or collect on your life insurance, and since I've been blocking his attempts to modify the trust, he decided to try the more direct approach." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her daughter was shifting restlessly, as if sensing her mother's distress. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. She opened the message to find a video file with no explanation, just a timestamp showing the previous afternoon. The footage was clearly from a security camera at a gas station, the image grainy but unmistakable. Bradford's Range Rover pulled up to the pumps, and Bradford himself climbed out, looking perfectly normal and relaxed. But instead of filling his fuel tank, he was filling red plastic containers. 3 of them, each one carefully topped off before being loaded into his vehicle. "Eleanor," Victoria said, her voice steady now despite the terror and rage coursing through her veins. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to believe me when I tell you the answer. Was Bradford trying to kill me last night?" Eleanor studied Victoria's face for a long moment, her experienced attorney's eyes taking in every detail. The bandages on Victoria's arms, the lingering smell of smoke in her hair, the haunted expression of someone who had stared death in the face and barely escaped. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I believe he was, and I believe he's going to try again." The validation hit Victoria like a wave of relief so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Someone believed her. Someone else could see the pattern, connect the dots, recognize the danger she was in. From downstairs came the sound of the front door closing, followed by Bradford's voice calling her name. The insurance investigators were gone. Her husband was looking for her, probably wanting to continue his performance as the concerned spouse. "What do I do?" Victoria asked. Eleanor gathered up the documents and tucked them back into the folder. "First, we document everything, every conversation, every interaction, every suspicious behavior. Second, we start building a legal case that proves you're not the mentally unstable woman he's trying to paint you as. And third," Eleanor's expression was grim but determined, "we make sure he doesn't get another chance to kill you." The sound of footsteps on the stairs meant Bradford was coming to check on her. Eleanor quickly kissed Victoria's forehead and whispered, "Trust no one but me, darling. Your life depends on it." As Eleanor slipped out through the nursery's second door, which led to the guest bathroom, Victoria arranged herself in the gliding chair and picked up a baby book, trying to look like a woman recovering from trauma rather than someone who had just uncovered a plot to murder her for money. Bradford appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression concerned and loving. "How are you feeling?" "Sweetheart, I saw Eleanor's car in the driveway. I hope she wasn't bothering you with business matters when you should be resting." "She just wanted to make sure I was okay," Victoria replied, her voice carefully neutral. "We didn't discuss anything important." But that was a lie. They had discussed the most important thing in the world, the fact that Bradford Sterling was going to try to kill her again. And next time, she needed to be ready. 3 days after the fire, Victoria watched from her bedroom window as a silver Honda Accord pulled into their circular driveway. The car was modest, practical, the kind of vehicle driven by someone who worked for a living rather than someone who inherited wealth or married into it. The young woman who emerged from the driver's seat looked nervous, her movements quick and furtive as she glanced around the estate grounds. She was petite and blonde, probably in her late 20s, dressed in business attire that was professional but not expensive. Designer knockoffs rather than the real thing. Victoria recognized her immediately. Miranda Cross, Bradford's secretary. The woman who answered his phone calls, managed his calendar, and handled the 1,000 small details that kept Sterling Enterprises running despite its mounting financial problems. The woman who was also, Victoria was beginning to suspect, much more than just Bradford's employee. Miranda rang the doorbell rather than using the intercom system, a small breach of protocol that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the Sterling family's wealth and formal procedures. Victoria answered the door herself, having dismissed their housekeeper for the day with a story about needing quiet time to recover. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm Miranda Cross from your husband's office." The young woman's voice trembled slightly, her eyes darting past Victoria as if expecting Bradford to appear at any moment. "He asked me to bring these documents by for him to review." She held out a manila envelope, but her hands were shaking visibly. Whatever was in that envelope, Miranda was terrified about delivering it. "Please come in," Victoria said, stepping aside. "Would you like some tea? In the kitchen?" Victoria went through the familiar ritual of preparing afternoon tea, each movement precise and controlled while her world continued its spiral into nightmare territory. Earl Grey for herself, chamomile for her guest, sugar and cream arranged on the silver tea service that had been a wedding gift from Bradford's mother. The methodical process gave her time to study Miranda Cross more closely. The young woman was beautiful in an obvious way, with highlights that cost more than her salary should have allowed, and subtle cosmetic procedures that suggested someone with expensive tastes. Her jewelry was real, not costume pieces, and her handbag bore a designer label that Victoria recognized from her own shopping expeditions to Rodeo Drive. All of which raised the question, how did a secretary afford such luxuries on what Sterling Enterprises could afford to pay in its current financial condition? "How long have you worked for my husband?" Victoria asked, settling into the chair across from Miranda at the kitchen island where she had once planned family dinners and birthday parties. 18 months, Miranda replied, accepting the delicate china cup with hands that continued to shake. "He's been very good to me, very generous with bonuses and opportunities." There was something in the way she said generous that confirmed Victoria's suspicions. The expensive highlights, the designer accessories, the obvious cosmetic work, all of it suggested a woman who was receiving financial support beyond her official salary. "Miranda," Victoria said gently, setting down her own teacup, "what aren't you telling me?" The direct question broke something inside the younger woman. Tears began streaming down her carefully made-up face as she fumbled for tissues in her expensive purse. "He said it would look like an accident," Miranda whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. "That you'd be okay, that you were planning to leave him anyway. I never thought he would actually hurt you. Not really hurt you." Victoria felt her blood turn to ice despite the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. "You knew about last night. He promised me we'd be together after," Miranda continued, her voice breaking. "Said your marriage was already over, that you wanted to disappear and start a new life somewhere else. He made it sound like you wanted to fake your own death to escape some kind of debt or legal trouble." The kitchen where Victoria had dreamed of teaching her daughter to cook, where she had imagined birthday parties and homework sessions, and all the mundane, precious moments of family life, suddenly felt like a crime scene. The marble countertops and custom cabinets and professional-grade appliances, all of it had been purchased with money that Bradford apparently didn't have, funded by loans against assets he was planning to acquire through her murder. Both women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Bradford's betrayal settling between them like a physical presence. Victoria placed a protective hand over her pregnant belly, feeling her daughter shift restlessly inside her womb, and tried to process the magnitude of what she was learning. "I deserved better than this elaborate betrayal." The thought came with surprising clarity, cutting through the shock and hurt. She had deserved honesty from the man she married. She had deserved fidelity and respect and basic human decency. She had deserved a husband who would protect her and their child, not one who would orchestrate their deaths for financial gain. "There were other times," Miranda continued, wiping her eyes with tissues that left mascara smudges on the white paper. "He called them practice runs, things that were supposed to look like accidents." Victoria remembered the incidents Miranda was referring to, moments of terror that she had dismissed as bad luck or maintenance issues. The balcony railing that had come loose while she was watering plants 3 stories above the concrete driveway, saved only by her quick reflexes in grabbing the window frame. The brake failure on the winding canyon road that had nearly sent her over a cliff, avoided only by steering into dense bushes instead of the guardrail. Each time, Bradford had been so concerned, so protective. He had called contractors to repair the railing, arranged for the car to be towed and inspected, held her while she shook from the close calls and made her feel safe again, while secretly planning the next attempt on her life. "Why are you telling me this?" Victoria asked. Miranda reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone, her fingers scrolling through what appeared to be a collection of audio files. "Because I recorded him. The conversations about the insurance money, about accessing your trust fund, about what would happen to me after you were gone. I thought maybe I could use them someday if he tried to leave me for someone else." She found the file she was looking for and pressed play. Bradford's voice filled the kitchen, clear and unmistakable, discussing Victoria's murder with the casual tone of someone planning a business merger. "The car fire should finish it," he was saying in the recording. 3 gallons of gasoline, professional accelerant pattern, child locks activated by remote override. No way she survives locked in there with that much fuel. And even if she somehow does escape, who's going to believe her paranoid story about me trying to kill her? Everyone knows pregnant women can develop severe mental health issues. Miranda's voice responded on the recording. What about the baby will collateral damage? Bradford replied without hesitation. The insurance payout is the same either way. And frankly, raising a kid would complicate things between us. This solves multiple problems at once. Victoria gripped the edge of the marble countertop, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. Hearing Bradford's casual dismissal of their daughter's life, the complete absence of any love or remorse in his voice, was somehow worse than experiencing the attempted murder firsthand. Their child wasn't even born yet, and he had already decided she was expendable. There's more, Miranda said quietly, advancing to another recording file. This one was from 2 days before the fire. Bradford's voice discussing contingency plans with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to his business deals. If the fire doesn't work for some reason, we go with the psychiatric angle. Have her committed for severe prenatal depression with psychotic features. Once she's locked up in a mental facility, I get power of attorney over her financial affairs, access to the trust fund, control of all her assets. She stays crazy, I stay rich. The casual cruelty in his tone made Victoria's skin crawl. He had mapped out her destruction with the same professional thoroughness he applied to property development deals. In Bradford's mind, she wasn't his wife or the mother of his child. She was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a source of funds to be accessed through whatever means necessary. Miranda looked up from her phone, her young face streaked with tears and regret. Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't make up for anything I've done, but I am truly deeply sorry. I thought I was in love with him. I thought he loved me back. Victoria studied the younger woman's face, seeing her own naive past self reflected there. The woman who had fallen for Bradford Sterling's charm and sophistication 5 years ago, who had believed his promises of forever and faithfully and all the lies that manipulative men told to get what they wanted from trusting women. He doesn't love either of us, Victoria said finally, her voice steady despite the pain. Men like Bradford don't love. They possess. They use. They acquire and consume and discard when something better comes along. But even as she spoke the words, Victoria felt something shifting in her chest. Not just heartbreak or betrayal, but something harder and more purposeful. A crystallization of resolve that surprised her with its intensity. Bradford had made a critical error in judgment. He thought he was dealing with the same trusting, dependent woman he had married 5 years ago. The woman who had given up her successful marketing career to be his perfect wife, who had allowed him to manage all their finances while she focused on decorating houses and planning charity events. He had no idea that woman was gone, burned away in the flames of his attempted murder. What remained was someone much more dangerous, a survivor with nothing left to lose. Miranda, Victoria said, leaning forward across the kitchen island, I need you to keep recording him. Everything he says about me, about the insurance, about his plans. Can you do that? The younger woman nodded eagerly, apparently relieved to have a chance at redemption. Yes, absolutely. But Mrs. Sterling, you have to be careful. If he suspects that you know about us, about what he's planning, he'll try again, Victoria finished. I know, but Miranda, he's going to try again anyway. The only question is whether I'll be ready for him when he does. After Miranda left, taking her recordings and her guilt and her promises to help gather more evidence, Victoria sat alone in the kitchen and planned her next moves. Bradford would be home soon, expecting to find the same traumatized, dependent woman he had been manipulating for months. Instead, he would find someone who knew exactly what kind of monster she had married, and someone who was preparing to fight back. Detective James Morrison called Victoria's cell phone at 7 in the morning, his voice carrying a new urgency that immediately put her on alert. She was sitting in the breakfast nook overlooking their manicured gardens, pretending to read pregnancy magazines while actually planning her survival strategy. Mrs. Sterling, I need you to come down to the station as soon as possible. We have some developments in your case that require immediate discussion. Victoria glanced toward the staircase, listening for sounds of Bradford moving around upstairs. He typically left for his office by 8:30, which would give her a narrow window to meet with Morrison without arousing suspicion. What kind of developments? She asked quietly. The kind that change everything. How soon can you be here? 30 minutes later. Victoria sat in the same sterile conference room at the Beverly Hills Police Department where she had first tried to convince skeptical law enforcement that her husband had attempted to murder her. But Detective Morrison's demeanor was completely different now, focused and intense rather than patronizingly gentle. Ryan Blackwood, the insurance investigator, was waiting with a thick file folder and a laptop computer. His expression was grim as he gestured for Victoria to take a seat across from them. "Mrs. Sterling, the fire investigation results came back from the lab," Morrison began without preamble. "This wasn't an electrical failure or mechanical malfunction. Someone poured approximately 3 gallons of premium gasoline around your vehicle in a specific pattern designed to ensure complete destruction of the passenger compartment." Victoria felt a mix of vindication and terror wash over her. She had been right about the gasoline smell, right about the deliberate nature of the attack. But being right meant that someone had genuinely tried to burn her alive, and that someone was currently sharing her bed and planning their daughter's future. "Professional job," Blackwood added, opening his laptop to display a series of photographs. "Whoever did this understood accelerant behavior, burn patterns, and destruction timing. This wasn't some desperate amateur attempt. It was methodical, calculated, and designed to leave minimal forensic evidence." The photographs showed Victoria's Mercedes from multiple angles, or what was left of it. The vehicle had been reduced to a blackened skeleton of twisted metal, the passenger compartment completely destroyed. If she hadn't broken that window when she did, there wouldn't have been enough remaining to identify her dental records. Morrison pulled out another series of photographs, these ones showing Bradford's Range Rover at different gas stations throughout the day before the fire. The images were clear enough to show his face, his license plate, and most damning of all, the red plastic containers he was filling with gasoline at each location. "We tracked his movements for 6 hours before the incident," Morrison explained. 3 different gas stations, purchasing fuel in containers rather than filling his vehicle's tank. The timestamps create a timeline that completely destroys his alibi about going for help. Victoria found herself unconsciously checking the door handle of the conference room, a nervous habit that had developed since the fire. Her fingers confirmed what her eyes could see unlocked, free to open, not a trap designed to contain her, while someone decided her fate. "There's more," Blackwood continued, advancing to another screen on his laptop. "Your life insurance policy. We had a handwriting expert analyze the signature on the application documents. He showed her copies of insurance forms bearing what appeared to be her signature, but the expert analysis revealed subtle inconsistencies in pressure, stroke pattern, and letter formation." "Forgery," Victoria said, though it wasn't really a question. "Almost certainly, but proving it in court is complicated by the fact that your husband would have had access to multiple samples of your genuine signature. A skilled forger with time and motivation could create something very convincing." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mrs. Sterling, I need to ask you directly, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Do you believe your husband is actively trying to kill you?" "Yes," Victoria replied without hesitation. "And I can prove it." She pulled out her own phone and played the recordings that Miranda had provided, watching both men's faces as Bradford's voice filled the room with casual discussions of murder, insurance fraud, and the planned elimination of his pregnant wife. "Jesus Christ," Morrison muttered as the recordings ended. "Where did you get these? His secretary? His mistress? Actually, she's been recording their conversations about me, about the insurance money, about his plans for my death." Victoria felt a strange calm settling over her as she spoke. For the first time since the fire, she was talking to people who believed her story and were taking her seriously. Blackwood was making rapid notes on his tablet. "This changes everything. With audio evidence of premeditation, we can move forward with attempted murder charges." "But there's a problem," Morrison said, his expression troubled. "These recordings were obtained without consent by a third party. Depending on how they were made and under what circumstances, they might not be admissible in court." Victoria felt her heart sink. "You mean he could get away with it because of a technicality?" "Not necessarily, but his attorneys will definitely try to have them excluded as evidence. We need more than just the recordings to build a solid case." Eleanor's son Thomas, the cybersecurity expert, had agreed to help investigate Bradford's digital trail. What they had discovered was a complex web of financial fraud that went far beyond simple murder for insurance money. Sterling Enterprises has been systematically looted, Thomas explained when Victoria met with him and Eleanor that afternoon at Eleanor's Century City office. Your husband has been moving assets into shell companies for over 2 years, creating a maze of fake corporations and offshore accounts. Thomas turned his laptop screen toward Victoria, displaying financial records and corporate filings that made her head spin. But here's the interesting part. Most of these shell companies are registered under your name. My name, forged signatures, fake documents, but legally speaking, you're listed as the owner of most of what Bradford has been hiding. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Victoria's shoulder. Sweetie, I think your husband has been planning this scheme for much longer than we initially realized. The implications were staggering. Bradford hadn't just decided to kill her for insurance money. He had been setting up a complex financial structure that would either result in her death and his inheritance of everything, or her survival and legal ownership of assets she had never known existed. But why would he want me to own them if he was planning to kill me? Thomas answered with a grim smile. Because dead people can't contest ownership of foreign bank accounts or shell company assets. If you had died in that fire, he would have been your grieving widower and sole heir, with legal access to everything registered in your name. Eleanor spread more documents across her conference table. There's something else, Victoria. Thomas also found probate documents that were filed yesterday morning. Probate documents. Legal paperwork for settling your estate after your death, Eleanor explained quietly. Preliminary forms claiming that you died in a vehicle fire on Mulholland Drive. They were filed 8 hours before the actual incident occurred. Victoria felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of Bradford's planning became clear. He hadn't just attempted murder. He had orchestrated an entire campaign of fraud, identity theft, and premeditated homicide that had been months in the making. The hardest part is admitting I knew something was wrong, but chose to trust him anyway. The validation whisper came with painful clarity now. Part of her had known, hadn't she? The late-night phone calls, the secretive meetings, the way Bradford had been pushing her to sign documents without reading them carefully. The signs had been there, but she had chosen love and trust over suspicion and self-preservation. That choice had nearly cost her everything. Victoria's phone rang, Bradford's name appearing on the caller ID. Eleanor nodded encouragingly, and Victoria answered with a voice that sounded remarkably steady. Hello, darling. Hi, sweetheart. How are you feeling today? Any more contractions or dizziness? Bradford's voice was warm and concerned, the perfect husband checking on his recovering wife. Much better, thank you. Dr. Campbell says the baby and I are both doing well. I'm so glad to hear that. Listen, I've been thinking we should get away for a few days. Let you recover properly in a peaceful environment. I've made reservations at that spa resort in Ojai that you love. Victoria met Eleanor's eyes across the conference table. A remote spa resort, isolated, private, far from witnesses or help. That sounds wonderful, Victoria said, injecting enthusiasm into her voice. When would we leave? Tonight, actually. I thought we could drive up after dinner, get settled in, start fresh tomorrow morning. The mountain air will do you good. A remote location where accidents could happen, where pregnant women under stress might suffer tragic falls or unexplained medical emergencies, where grieving husbands could return home alone with heartbreaking stories about sudden complications. I can't wait, Victoria lied smoothly. Should I pack anything special? Just comfortable clothes and your medications? Everything else is taken care of. After she hung up, the three of them sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications. He's escalating, Eleanor said finally. The insurance investigation, the police questions, Miranda's obvious guilt. He knows the walls are closing in. If the fire didn't work, he's moving to a backup plan. What kind of backup plan? Victoria asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Thomas answered grimly, making sure you don't survive the romantic getaway. But Victoria was beginning to formulate a plan of her own. Bradford thought he was dealing with the same trusting woman he had married 5 years ago. He had no idea that his attempted murder had forged her into something much more dangerous. A survivor who was ready to fight back. Eleanor, Victoria said, her voice steady and determined, I need you to make some calls. And Thomas, I need you to set up some digital surveillance. If Bradford wants to take me to Ojai, then that's exactly where we're going. Victoria, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. No, Victoria replied, one hand resting protectively over her belly. What's dangerous is letting him continue to believe he's winning. It's time to turn the tables. The trap Bradford had been setting for months was about to become his own prison. He just didn't know it yet. The Pasadena Hills psychiatric facility looked like a luxury resort from the outside. All modern glass and calming earth tones designed to make mental illness seem manageable and temporary. Victoria sat in her Mercedes in the visitor parking lot, unable to force herself to walk through the main entrance. The building loomed before her like a beautiful prison, and she knew that once she stepped inside, she might never come out. The morning had started with Margaret Sterling arriving at the house accompanied by Dr. Philip Hendricks, a psychiatrist who specialized in prenatal mental health disorders. Together, they had painted a picture of Victoria that was both familiar and terrifying, a woman whose pregnancy had triggered severe psychological instability. She's been having increasingly disturbing paranoid episodes, Margaret had explained to Dr. Hendricks, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Accusing my son of attempting to harm her, creating elaborate conspiracy theories about insurance fraud and murder plots. Last night she called me at 2 a.m, claiming that Bradford was planning to kill her during their romantic getaway. Dr. Hendricks had nodded solemnly while making notes on his tablet computer. Pregnancy can trigger latent mental health issues, particularly in women with family histories of psychological disorders. The hormonal changes, combined with the stress of impending motherhood, can create what we call a perfect storm of delusional thinking and paranoid ideation. Victoria had listened to them discuss her as if she weren't sitting right there, her hands folded over her 8-month belly, her face carefully composed to hide the rage and terror she felt. They spoke about her in clinical terms, reducing her to a collection of symptoms and risk factors rather than a person who had survived an attempted murder. The concerning element, Dr. Hendricks had continued, is how detailed and internally consistent her delusions have become. She's created an entire narrative about financial fraud, secret recordings, and elaborate murder plots. To someone unfamiliar with prenatal psychosis, her story might seem plausible. Margaret had dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of concerned mother-in-law to perfection. We just want to help her. Bradford is beside himself with worry. He blames himself for not recognizing the signs earlier. Now, sitting outside the psychiatric facility, Victoria understood the true genius of Bradford's plan. He hadn't just tried to kill her body. He was systematically destroying her credibility, her support system, and her legal rights. If she couldn't convince anyone that she was sane and competent, she would have no way to fight back against his schemes. 3 times she reached for the car door handle, and 3 times she pulled her hand back. Going inside felt like surrender, like accepting Bradford's version of reality where she was the crazy one and he was the devoted husband trying to save her. But staying outside meant abandoning her only chance to prove her sanity to the medical professionals who would ultimately determine her fate. Her phone rang. Detective Morrison's voice was strained when she answered. Mrs. Sterling, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news. The district attorney's office is reluctant to file charges against your husband based on the current evidence. Victoria felt the walls of her world closing in. But you have the recordings, the forensic evidence, the insurance fraud. The recordings were obtained through questionable means by a third party with her own agenda. Bradford's attorneys are painting Miranda Cross as an unstable woman trying to break up a marriage, claiming she fabricated the audio files using deepfake technology. Victoria's heart sank as Morrison continued. They're also arguing that your accusations are the result of severe mental illness related to your pregnancy. Dr. Hendricks has submitted a preliminary psychological evaluation suggesting that you're experiencing prenatal psychosis with paranoid delusions. That's impossible. I haven't even met with Dr. Hendricks privately. He's basing his assessment on interviews with your husband and mother-in-law, combined with what he calls observable behavioral indicators during this morning's intervention attempt. Morrison's voice was sympathetic but defeated. Mrs. Sterling, I believe you, but belief isn't enough for a conviction. We need evidence that can stand up in court, and right now, Bradford's legal team is successfully undermining everything we have. After Morrison hung up, Victoria sat in her car and tried to process the complete collapse of her support system. The police couldn't help her. The legal system wouldn't believe her. Her own mother-in-law was working actively against her, and the medical establishment was preparing to declare her insane. She drove aimlessly through the hills above Pasadena, her mind reeling from the systematic destruction of her credibility and options. Every institution she had trusted was failing her. Every authority figure was either dismissing her claims or actively supporting Bradford's narrative about her mental instability. Eventually, she found herself at El Matador Beach in Malibu, where her father had taught her to surf when she was 12 years old. The Pacific stretched endlessly before her, indifferent to human suffering but somehow familiar in its vastness. Victoria parked and walked down to the sand, her designer flats filling with grit as she made her way toward the water's edge. The waves crashed against the rocky cliffs with hypnotic regularity, a rhythm that had been constant since long before her birth and would continue long after her death. She sat on the sand fully clothed, letting the salt spray dampen her maternity dress, and tried to understand how her life had become completely unrecognizable. 6 months ago, she had been planning nursery decorations and reading baby books. Now she was a target for murder, branded as mentally ill, and running out of options for protecting herself and her daughter. Starting over feels impossible, but staying feels like death. The thought came with startling clarity, cutting through her despair. She could keep fighting Bradford's manipulation, keep trying to prove her sanity to people who had already decided she was delusional, or she could disappear entirely, take her daughter and build a new life somewhere far from sterling enterprises and insurance policies and attempted murder. But running felt like letting Bradford win. It felt like abandoning every other woman who might find herself in a similar situation, trapped by a manipulative husband and a system that refused to believe her. Victoria's phone buzzed with a call from Eleanor, followed immediately by a text message that made her blood run cold. Emergency. Bradford's lawyers have filed for emergency conservatorship, hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. They're claiming you're mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs. The final piece of Bradford's plan clicked into place with terrible clarity. He didn't just want to kill her anymore. That approach had become too risky with the police investigation and insurance scrutiny. Instead, he was going to have her declared legally insane, stripped of her rights, and locked away in an institution where she would be completely under his control. Once he had conservatorship over her person and property, he could access her trust fund legally. He could make medical decisions on her behalf, including decisions about her pregnancy and the fate of their daughter. He could commit her indefinitely to psychiatric facilities while managing her money and assets. It was a perfect prison legal, medically justified, and practically impossible to escape once the court system had declared her incompetent. Victoria drove back to the Malibu house as darkness fell over California, her mind working through possibilities and contingencies. Bradford's Range Rover was already in the driveway, which meant he had canceled their romantic getaway to Ojai. The psychiatric intervention had obviously been more successful than attempting to lure her to an isolated location. She found him in his study, speaking quietly into his phone. He looked up when she entered and smiled, the same warm expression that had made her fall in love with him 5 years ago. "There you are, sweetheart. Dr. Hendricks called to express his concerns about your behavior today. Running away from the consultation, driving erratically through the mountains, everyone's very worried about you." "What kind of worried?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "The kind of worried that requires immediate intervention for your own safety." Bradford ended his phone call and moved toward her, his expression gentle but determined. "Victoria, we need to talk about getting you some professional help." "What kind of help?" "Inpatient treatment, just for a few weeks, until after the baby's born and your hormones stabilize. Somewhere safe and peaceful where you can rest and recover from whatever's been happening to you these past few months." Bradford reached out and touched her cheek with apparent tenderness. "I know this is scary, but you have to trust me. I'm trying to save you from yourself." The word trust hit Victoria like a physical blow. Trust was what had gotten her into this nightmare in the first place. Trust was what Bradford was counting on to finish destroying her completely. But looking into his eyes, those same brown eyes that had once made her feel safe and loved Victoria, realized something crucial. Bradford wasn't just confident that he would win this battle. He was certain that she had already lost. And maybe, just maybe, that overconfidence would become his greatest weakness. "Bradford," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." "What is it, sweetheart?" Victoria met his gaze directly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I remember everything. I know exactly what you did to me, what you're planning to do, and what you think is going to happen next." For just a moment, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. The mask of concerned husband slipped for just an instant, revealing something much colder underneath. "Victoria, you're scaring me. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that Dr. Hendricks was talking about." But Victoria had seen what she needed to see. Bradford was still playing his role, still committed to the narrative of her insanity, which meant he hadn't yet realized that his greatest asset, his wife's trust and dependence, had been completely destroyed. Tomorrow's conservatorship hearing would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as a legal non-person in a psychiatric facility. But tonight, Victoria Sterling was going to make sure that Bradford's overconfidence became his downfall. She wasn't the helpless victim he thought she was anymore. She was a survivor with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And she was about to remind him why underestimating women could be the last mistake a man ever made. At 2 a.m, Victoria sat at Eleanor's kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and the fragments of her shattered life. The guest house in Hancock Park had become her sanctuary, the only place where she could think clearly without Bradford's presence poisoning the air around her. Eleanor had insisted she move out of the Malibu mansion after the psychiatric intervention, using the cover story that Victoria needed a quiet place to recover from her breakdown. Bradford had been surprisingly supportive of the idea, probably because it made his narrative about her mental illness more credible to outside observers. But isolation also gave Victoria something she had lost months ago: freedom to investigate, plan, and fight back without constant surveillance. In her lowest moment, surrounded by evidence of her husband's elaborate scheme to destroy her, Victoria remembered her father's words from his deathbed 2 years earlier. "When they count you out, sweetheart, that's when you have the most power. They're not watching anymore." Robert Chen had built his software company from nothing, surviving 3 economic downturns and multiple attempts by larger corporations to steal his innovations or drive him out of business. He had taught Victoria that the most dangerous opponent was the one everyone assumed was defeated. Bradford thought she was broken, mentally ill, legally powerless. The medical establishment had written her off as delusional. Even some of her former friends had stopped returning her calls, uncomfortable with her paranoid accusations about her devoted husband, which meant they had stopped watching her carefully. They had stopped anticipating her moves, stopped preparing for retaliation, stopped treating her like a threat. That was going to be their mistake. Victoria walked to the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. The woman looking back was pale and exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and the haunted expression of someone who had stared death in the face and barely escaped. She looked exactly like someone having a mental breakdown, which made her decision easier. Victoria picked up the scissors from Eleanor's vanity drawer and began cutting her hair, watching expensive salon highlights fall to the tile floor in golden waves. She kept cutting until her carefully styled bob became something shorter, sharper, more businesslike. The woman in the mirror transformed with each snip of the scissors. Less Beverly Hills trophy wife, more corporate executive, less victim, more survivor. Taking back control over her appearance felt like taking back control over her choices, her future, her very identity. Thomas arrived that morning with coffee in his laptop bag, looking every inch the tech genius he was rather than Eleanor's son. At 35, he had the kind of analytical mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. "I've been thinking about your situation all night," he said, setting up his equipment on Eleanor's dining room table. "Bradford is playing a sophisticated game, but he's making a crucial assumption about your capabilities." "What kind of assumption?" "That you're only capable of reacting to his moves rather than making strategic moves of your own." Thomas opened several windows on his laptop screen, displaying financial records and corporate documents. "He's been so focused on painting you as mentally incompetent that he's gotten sloppy with his actual crimes." The screen showed a complex web of financial transactions, shell companies, and international transfers that mapped out Bradford's fraud in stunning detail. "All those shell companies registered in your name. They're not just hiding his assets. They're hiding his debts and liabilities too. Victoria leaned forward, her marketing background helping her understand the implications. So legally, I don't just own the money he's been hiding, I own the debts he's been avoiding. Exactly, but here's where it gets interesting. Thomas highlighted several transactions that showed massive transfers between accounts. Some of these shell companies actually own pieces of Sterling Enterprises itself. If we can prove you're the legal owner of these entities, I could own his company, Victoria finished, the possibilities beginning to crystallize in her mind. Eleanor joined them at the table, carrying fresh coffee and looking like the formidable attorney she had been for 30 years. We've been approaching this backwards, darling. Instead of trying to prove Bradford is guilty of attempted murder, we need to prove that you're not only mentally competent, but actually brilliant enough to uncover massive corporate fraud. How do we do that? By demonstrating that your so-called paranoid delusions are actually sophisticated financial analysis that uncovered crimes no one else detected. Eleanor spread her own documents across the table. We turn you from victim into whistleblower. They spent the next 8 hours building Victoria's case, not as a woman suffering from prenatal psychosis, but as a business analyst who had discovered one of the largest financial fraud schemes in California history. Thomas documented the shell companies, traced the hidden assets, and mapped the international money transfers that showed the scope of Bradford's crimes. Miranda, consumed by guilt over her role in the murder plot, provided not just the audio recordings of Bradford's murder plans, but also financial documents he had asked her to forge, email communications about hiding assets, and detailed records of his extramarital expenses. There's something else, Miranda said during one of their evening strategy sessions at Eleanor's house. Bradford has been talking about having you committed permanently. He found a private facility in Switzerland that specializes in long-term care for wealthy families with what he calls difficult relatives. Victoria felt ice water flowing through her veins. You mean he wants me locked up forever? Essentially, yes. He told me that once you're declared incompetent and institutionalized, he can claim the baby was born prematurely due to your mental state. He gets custody of your daughter, access to your trust fund, and you disappear into the Swiss medical system where no one will ever question your condition. The magnitude of Bradford's plan hit Victoria like a physical blow. He wasn't just trying to steal her money or even kill her outright anymore. He was trying to erase her completely, to make her cease to exist as a person while keeping her alive as a legal fiction he could control indefinitely. But hearing the details of his scheme also crystallized something important in Victoria's mind. Bradford had been so focused on destroying her credibility that he had underestimated her intelligence, her resourcefulness, and her capacity for strategic thinking. I'm not the victim in this story anymore. I'm the detective. The validation whisper came with surprising strength and clarity. She had been accepting the role of victim that Bradford and his lawyers had assigned her, letting them define her as helpless and mentally unstable. But victims were passive, detectives were active, and she had just uncovered the biggest financial fraud case in California history. Eleanor's study became their war room over the following days. Every document was organized with military precision, every connection mapped and cross-referenced, every piece of evidence cataloged according to its legal significance. Victoria threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. You're different, Eleanor observed one evening as they reviewed deposition transcripts and financial records. Stronger somehow? More focused? Victoria touched her newly shortened hair, feeling the unfamiliar length that marked her transformation. I'm remembering who I was before I became Mrs. Bradford Sterling. The woman she had been before marriage was ambitious and intelligent, capable of running her own successful marketing firm and making complex strategic decisions. She had made the mistake of thinking that love meant surrender, that being a good wife required giving up her own power and agency. But power, once recognized and reclaimed, was difficult to surrender again. Thomas discovered Bradford's most damaging secret 3 days before the conservatorship hearing. He found it buried in blockchain records and cryptocurrency exchanges, hidden behind layers of digital encryption that had taken him hours to penetrate. Sterling Enterprises isn't just bankrupt, Thomas explained, his laptop screen showing transaction records that made Victoria's head spin. It's been running a massive Ponzi scheme. Bradford has been using your trust fund as collateral for loans to pay earlier investors, but the loans are secured against properties that the company sold years ago to other shell companies that don't actually exist. Victoria studied the financial documents, her business background helping her understand the implications. So when the truth comes out, the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. The company, the debts, the fake assets, everything. Thomas highlighted several transactions. Everything except what's legitimately registered in your name, which thanks to Bradford's shell company games, is actually quite substantial. Eleanor smiled with grim satisfaction. He's been so clever about hiding assets in your name to avoid his own creditors that he's accidentally made you the legal owner of most of his legitimate wealth. The irony was perfect. Bradford's own fraudulent scheme had created the legal framework for his complete destruction. While he had been planning Victoria's death or institutionalization, he had been systematically transferring ownership of his real assets to her name. Victoria felt a strange calm settling over her as the pieces fell into place. Tomorrow, Bradford would try to have her declared mentally incompetent. His lawyers would argue that she was a danger to herself and her unborn child, that she needed permanent institutional care for her own protection. But they had no idea what she had been building in Eleanor's guest house. They had no concept of the legal and financial weapons she had assembled while they dismissed her as a delusional, pregnant woman. She reorganized Eleanor's study one final time that night, every document filed with perfect precision. The room looked like the headquarters of a Fortune 500 corporation, not the hideout of a mentally ill woman having pregnancy-induced delusions. Victoria stood in the center of her war room and made a promise to her unborn daughter and to herself. By tomorrow evening, one of them would be destroyed completely. She intended to make absolutely certain it wasn't her. The trap Bradford had been setting for months was about to snap shut around his own throat. He just didn't realize it yet. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning at the Stanley Mosk Courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. Victoria dressed with the same care she had once brought to important marketing presentations, understanding that everything about her appearance would be scrutinized and analyzed by people determining her fate. Gone were the flowing maternity dresses and soft pastels that had defined her identity as Bradford's wife. Instead, she wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit that accommodated her 8-month pregnancy while projecting competence and authority. Her shortened hair was styled in a professional bob that made her look like a serious businesswoman rather than a fragile trophy wife. She carried Eleanor's leather briefcase and wore minimal makeup, presenting herself as someone who belonged in a boardroom making important decisions rather than in a psychiatric facility having her choices made by others. Bradford was waiting in the courthouse lobby with his legal team when Victoria arrived. 3 expensive attorneys in matching suits surrounded him like protective armor, their briefcases thick with documents designed to prove his wife's mental incompetence. He rushed to Victoria's side with perfect timing, playing his role as the concerned husband for the benefit of anyone watching. "Sweetheart, you didn't have to come today. This is just a formality to make sure you get the medical attention you need." His voice carried exactly the right mixture of love and worry. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Victoria replied, her tone pleasant but neutral. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided over the hearing, a woman in her mid-50s who had built her reputation on cutting through legal theatrics to find truth. Victoria had researched her extensively during her preparation. Judge Hawkins had little patience for manipulation and was known for her careful attention to evidence rather than emotional appeals. Bradford's lead attorney, Martin Crenshaw, opened with a presentation that painted Victoria as a tragically disturbed woman whose pregnancy had triggered severe psychological collapse. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sterling has been exhibiting classic symptoms of prenatal psychosis over the past several months. Paranoid delusions about her devoted husband, elaborate conspiracy theories involving insurance fraud and attempted murder, and most disturbingly, accusations that have absolutely no foundation in reality." Crenshaw presented medical testimony from Dr. Hendricks, who had never actually examined Victoria privately, but was basing his diagnosis on secondhand reports and what he called observable behavioral indicators. The respondent has created an internally consistent but completely delusional narrative about financial fraud, secret recordings, and murder plots. Dr. Hendricks testified, "This type of systematic paranoid thinking is characteristic of severe mental illness, particularly dangerous when combined with the hormonal instability of late pregnancy." Margaret Sterling took the stand to describe her daughter-in-law's shocking transformation from loving wife to paranoid accuser. She spoke with the authority of someone who had never been questioned, painting Bradford as a saint dealing with his wife's tragic mental decline. She called me at 2 in the morning, claiming that Bradford was planning to kill her during a romantic getaway, Margaret testified, dabbing at her eyes with practiced precision. She's become convinced that everyone around her is part of some vast conspiracy. It's heartbreaking to watch someone you love lose touch with reality so completely. By the time they finished their presentation, Victoria appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a woman desperately in need of psychiatric intervention and legal protection from her own delusions. Then Eleanor stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Sterling is not only mentally competent, but has in fact uncovered one of the largest financial fraud schemes in California history." The courtroom fell silent. This wasn't the direction anyone had expected the hearing to take. Eleanor's presentation began methodically, establishing Victoria's educational background and professional experience before marriage. MBA from UCLA, successful marketing career, demonstrated competence in financial analysis and strategic planning. Mrs. Sterling didn't develop paranoid delusions. Your Honor, she developed legitimate concerns based on concrete evidence of actual crimes being committed against her and numerous other victims. Victoria took the witness stand and began walking Judge Hawkins through her investigation. She spoke clearly and methodically, presenting financial documents with the confidence of someone who understood every number and transaction. "I began noticing irregularities in our household finances approximately 4 months ago," Victoria testified, her voice steady and professional. "Unexplained expenditures, unusual cash flow patterns, and what appeared to be systematic asset transfers that I hadn't authorized." She presented bank statements, corporate filings, and shell company documentation with the precision of a forensic accountant. This wasn't the rambling testimony of a delusional woman. This was the detailed analysis of a financial expert who had done her homework meticulously. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Hawkins said, leaning forward with obvious interest, "these are very serious allegations you're making. Do you understand the implications of what you're telling this court?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm alleging that my husband has committed insurance fraud, attempted murder, identity theft, money laundering, and the systematic looting of his own company over a period of several years." Eleanor played the audio recordings Miranda had provided, Bradford's voice filling the courtroom as he casually discussed murder, insurance payouts, and the planned institutionalization of his wife. The car fire should finish it. No way she survives locked in there with that much accelerant. And even if she somehow does escape, who's going to believe her paranoid story about me trying to kill her? The courtroom erupted as Bradford's own words destroyed his carefully constructed narrative. His attorneys were on their feet objecting, demanding the recordings be excluded. But the damage was irreversible. Everyone had heard Bradford Sterling planning his pregnant wife's murder in his own voice. Judge Hawkins called for a brief recess, but Victoria wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence that demonstrates the premeditated nature of these crimes." Victoria produced the probate documents Thomas had discovered. "These are preliminary estate settlement forms filed by my husband's attorneys, claiming that I died in a vehicle fire. They were filed 8 hours before the actual incident occurred." The legal implications hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Bradford had been so confident of his wife's death that he had begun settling her estate before actually killing her. The timestamps on the documents proved premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Eleanor filed emergency motions as the hearing continued, not for divorce or separation, but for a comprehensive criminal investigation into Sterling Enterprises and its financial practices. They weren't just going after Bradford personally anymore. They were dismantling his entire business empire. Victoria realized something crucial as she watched the proceedings unfold. The shell companies were registered in her name with forged signatures, but they were still legally hers. Bradford's own fraud had made her the rightful owner of most of his hidden assets. The prison door was unlocked all along. I was my own warden. The validation came with perfect clarity. She had been trapped not by Bradford's actions, but by her own acceptance of the limitations he had placed on her. The moment she stopped believing his narrative about her incompetence, his power over her had evaporated completely. Judge Hawkins denied the conservatorship petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again based on the same allegations. But she didn't stop there. Mr. Sterling, based on the evidence presented today, I'm issuing an emergency restraining order preventing you from having any contact with your wife. I'm also ordering the immediate freezing of all assets associated with Sterling Enterprises, pending a comprehensive criminal investigation. The trap Victoria had spent weeks constructing snapped shut around Bradford with devastating precision. His financial empire was frozen, his personal freedom was restricted, and his reputation was destroyed in a single morning. But Bradford wasn't finished fighting. As court security officers moved toward him, he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his situation. Your Honor, you can't do this to me. I built an empire from nothing. She's nothing without me. This is all lies and manipulation. Bradford's mask of civilized concern had finally slipped completely, revealing the narcissistic rage that had always lurked beneath his charming exterior. The devoted husband persona crumbled as he showed his true nature to everyone in the courtroom. Actually, Victoria said from the witness stand, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, I own your empire, have for months, apparently, thanks to your own fraudulent documentation. The expression of shock and fury on Bradford's face was worth every moment of terror she had endured. He had underestimated her completely, dismissed her as mentally ill and legally powerless. While she had systematically gathered the evidence needed to destroy him, Bradford Sterling, master manipulator and would-be murderer, had been outplayed by the woman he had tried to kill. And now he would spend the rest of his life paying for that fatal mistake. The arrest happened in real time, right there in the courthouse hallway outside Judge Hawkins' courtroom. Detective Morrison and FBI financial crimes agents surrounded Bradford Sterling as the full reality of his situation finally penetrated his narcissistic certainty. Victoria watched from the courthouse steps, one hand resting protectively on her 8-month belly as federal agents led her husband away in handcuffs. The baby was moving restlessly, as if sensing her mother's mixture of relief and vindication after months of terror and gaslighting. The media had descended on the courthouse like locusts, drawn by the combination of wealth, attempted murder, and the spectacular public destruction of a prominent businessman. Camera crews and reporters created a chaotic carnival atmosphere as Bradford was guided toward the waiting federal transport vehicle. You can't do this to me. Bradford shouted over the noise, his voice echoing off the marble courthouse facade. I built Sterling Enterprises from nothing. I created jobs, developed communities, contributed millions to charity. She's nothing without me. But his protest sounded hollow and desperate now. The ravings of a man whose carefully constructed public image had been shattered by his own recorded words. The devoted husband and successful entrepreneur persona had crumbled, replaced by something ugly and entitled that demanded the right to destroy anyone who threatened his comfort. Miranda Cross stood beside Victoria on the courthouse steps, her young face pale but resolute. She had testified for over 3 hours, providing details about the financial fraud, the murder plot, and Bradford's systematic campaign to gaslight his wife into submission. Are you okay? Miranda asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the media chaos surrounding them. Victoria considered the question carefully. Was she okay? Her marriage was over, her husband was going to prison, and she was 8 months pregnant with the child of a man who had tried to burn her alive for insurance money. Her entire life had been revealed as an elaborate lie constructed around the greed and sociopathy of someone she had loved and trusted completely. Actually, Victoria said, watching the federal transport disappear into Los Angeles traffic, I think I'm better than I've been in years. For the first time since the night of the fire, she felt truly safe. Bradford could no longer manipulate her, gaslight her, or threaten her life. His power over her had been completely and permanently destroyed. The legal proceedings moved with surprising efficiency once the FBI took control of the case. With audio recordings, financial evidence, and Miranda's detailed testimony about the murder plot, Bradford's attorneys quickly advised him that fighting the charges would only result in a longer prison sentence. He pleaded guilty to attempted murder, insurance fraud, money laundering, and racketeering in exchange for a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The plea bargain also required him to forfeit all assets that could be traced to his criminal activities, which included virtually everything he had accumulated during his marriage to Victoria. Victoria attended the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Grace Eleanor Sterling had arrived 2 weeks early but healthy, as if eager to enter a world where her mother was finally free from the man who had tried to kill them both. The federal courthouse was packed with victims of Bradford's various fraud schemes: investors who had lost their retirement savings, contractors who had never been paid for their work, and employees whose pension funds had been looted to support Bradford's lifestyle and criminal activities. Bradford looked diminished somehow in his orange jumpsuit, the expensive suits and confident bearing replaced by the institutional anonymity of the federal prison system. When he stood to address the court before sentencing, he attempted one final manipulation. "Your Honor, I made mistakes driven by desperation and financial pressure. My company was failing, and I was afraid of letting down the employees and investors who depended on me. I never intended for anyone to be seriously hurt, particularly not my wife and child." The lies came easily, naturally, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Bradford Sterling simply could not accept responsibility for the magnitude of his crimes, choosing instead to portray himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of other people's destruction. Judge Martinez had reviewed the case materials extensively and was clearly unimpressed by Bradford's performance. "Mr. Sterling, you attempted to murder your pregnant wife by trapping her in a burning vehicle and driving away. You planned to have her declared mentally incompetent so you could steal her inheritance. You systematically defrauded investors, employees, and contractors out of millions of dollars to fund your personal lifestyle. This court finds no mitigating circumstances in your actions." As the bailiff led Bradford away to begin his 25-year sentence, he turned for one final look at Victoria. She met his gaze steadily, no longer the frightened woman who had escaped his burning trap 6 months earlier. "I survived because I was stronger than either of us realized." The validation came with perfect clarity. She had survived not just the physical attempt on her life, but the psychological warfare, the legal manipulation, and the systematic destruction of her support system. And in surviving, she had discovered reserves of strength and intelligence that even she hadn't known she possessed. But the most shocking revelation came during the victim impact portion of the hearing, when federal prosecutor Janet Walsh revealed information that had only recently come to light. "Your Honor, the defendant's criminal behavior extends far beyond this case. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of a similar pattern of fraud and violence in Colorado, where Mr. Sterling was previously married." Victoria felt the courtroom spinning around her as the prosecutor continued. "Caroline Sterling died in what was initially ruled a hiking accident in 2014. She fell from a cliff while hiking alone with her husband in Rocky Mountain National Park. Mr. Sterling collected $2 million in life insurance benefits and relocated to California shortly thereafter." The magnitude of Bradford's evil crashed over Victoria like a physical wave. She wasn't his first victim. There had been another woman, another wife who had loved and trusted Bradford Sterling, another woman who had died so he could collect insurance money and start fresh somewhere else: Caroline Sterling. The name would be added to the memorial wall Victoria was planning for the Sterling Foundation headquarters. Another woman whose life had been stolen by the man sitting in shackles 20 feet away. After the hearing, Eleanor drove Victoria and baby Grace back to the Santa Monica house Victoria had purchased with proceeds from the liquidated Sterling Enterprises assets. The federal government had seized Bradford's personal property, but the shell companies registered in Victoria's name, along with their substantial legitimate assets, had been transferred to her ownership. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked as they sat in the living room overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Grace was nursing contentedly, unaware that she had just witnessed her father being sentenced to spend the rest of his productive life in federal prison. Victoria looked out at the endless expanse of water that had once represented escape and solitude during her darkest moments. Now it represented possibility, freedom, and the chance to build something meaningful from the ruins of Bradford's criminal empire. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else," she said quietly. "I'm going to use every dollar he stole, every asset he hid, every connection he built, and turn it into something that protects women instead of destroying them." Sterling Enterprises, under Victoria's new management, would become the Sterling Foundation, a comprehensive resource center for women escaping domestic violence, financial abuse, and legal manipulation. The ultimate irony: Bradford's criminal empire would be transformed into everything he had opposed and feared. Margaret Sterling had contested the asset transfers, claiming that her daughter-in-law was mentally unfit to manage such substantial wealth, But with Bradford's conviction for attempted murder and the clear evidence of the shell company fraud, her legal challenges had been dismissed with prejudice. Eleanor was considering retirement, finally ready to enjoy her golden years, knowing that her promise to Victoria's father had been fulfilled beyond anyone's expectations. Miranda had moved to Portland, where she worked as a victim advocate and attended trauma therapy twice weekly. The recordings that had helped convict Bradford had been the beginning of her own healing process. The house felt different from the Malibu mansion, lighter somehow and filled with genuine peace rather than the artificial perfection that had masked so much cruelty. Victoria found herself checking door locks out of habit, but the gesture had evolved from trauma response to practical security measure. She wasn't checking to see if she was trapped anymore. She was making sure that she and Grace were safe in their sanctuary. Grace Eleanor Sterling would grow up knowing that her mother had faced down a monster and won. She would learn about financial independence, legal rights, and the importance of trusting her instincts when something felt wrong. She would never have to wonder whether the people who claimed to love her were actually planning her destruction. The evening news carried the story of Bradford's sentencing, describing it as the conclusion of one of the most shocking cases of domestic violence and financial fraud in California history. Legal experts praised the prosecution's innovative approach, using Bradford's own fraudulent documentation to build the case for his victim's competence and his own criminality. Victoria turned off the television and carried Grace upstairs to the nursery she had decorated herself. No more pastel yellows or gender-neutral themes. This room was painted in bold blues and greens, with pictures of strong women throughout history on the walls and shelves lined with books about science, adventure, and possibility. As she settled into the rocking chair to read Grace a bedtime story, Victoria felt the profound satisfaction of a battle won and a future secured. Bradford Sterling would spend the next 25 years in a federal penitentiary, while the daughter he had tried to kill would grow up free, safe, and surrounded by the resources to build whatever life she chose. Justice, Victoria had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, protection, and making sure that evil actions ultimately served good purposes. Bradford had thought he was destroying her to save himself. Instead, he had forged her into something far more dangerous than he had ever been: a survivor with unlimited resources and an unshakable commitment to protecting other women from men like him. 2 years after Bradford's sentencing, Victoria stood at the podium in the main conference hall of the Sterling Foundation headquarters, looking out at an audience of 500 women who had come to hear her speak about financial empowerment and domestic violence recovery. The building itself was a testament to transformation. The former Sterling Enterprises corporate headquarters had been completely redesigned. The cold marble and intimidating architecture replaced with warm woods, natural lighting, and spaces designed to make survivors feel safe rather than intimidated. Grace Eleanor Sterling, now a healthy and happy 2-year-old, sat in the front row with Eleanor, babbling quietly to herself while playing with blocks that spelled out strong and brave and free. She had Bradford's dark hair but Victoria's green eyes, and when she smiled, she showed no trace of her father's capacity for manipulation or cruelty. "We think survival is about escaping danger," Victoria told her audience, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "But real survival is about building something so strong that danger can't touch you anymore." She wore her father's compass on a simple gold chain, the needle pointing toward true north as she spoke about the journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The woman who had once been trapped in a burning car was now the CEO of one of California's most influential nonprofits, using Bradford's stolen millions to protect other women from the kind of destruction he had tried to visit on her. The Sterling Foundation provided legal aid, financial counseling, emergency housing, and job training for women escaping abusive relationships. They had successfully lobbied for stronger laws against financial abuse and had trained thousands of law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of economic manipulation and coercive control. But perhaps most importantly, they had created a network of survivors who supported each other through the complex process of rebuilding their lives after betrayal and trauma. In the audience, Victoria spotted Detective Morrison, who had driven down from Los Angeles to hear her presentation. The case that had started with a burning car and a pregnant woman's desperate escape had become legendary in law enforcement circles. Studied as an example of how perpetrators could be caught by their own arrogance and their victims' intelligence. After her presentation, women approached Victoria with their own stories of financial abuse, gaslighting, and legal manipulation. Some were still trapped in situations similar to what Victoria had experienced. Others had escaped, but were struggling to rebuild their independence and security. Victoria listened to each story, offered resources and referrals, and reminded them of their own strength and capability. She had become what she had never planned to be, a symbol of resistance against men who used money, law, and psychological manipulation to control women. "The hardest part," one woman told her, "is trusting myself again after someone spent so long convincing me I was crazy." Victoria understood completely. "That's not weakness," she replied. "That's the natural result of systematic psychological abuse. The fact that you're here, asking questions and seeking help, proves that your instincts are working perfectly." The Sterling Foundation had grown rapidly, funded by the liquidated assets of Bradford's criminal empire. What had once been used to finance his lifestyle and illegal activities now supported research into financial abuse, advocacy training programs, and direct services for survivors. They had also established the Caroline Sterling Memorial Fund, dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths of women whose husbands had collected substantial life insurance payouts. The fund had already helped reopen 3 cold cases and had contributed to 2 additional murder convictions. Bradford had been more prolific in his predatory behavior than anyone had initially realized. On Grace's 2nd birthday, Victoria made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her story. She sold the Santa Monica house and purchased a smaller home just blocks from the beach where her father had taught her to surf decades earlier. The new house had 4 bedrooms, one for Victoria, one for Grace, one for a home office where she could work on foundation business, and one for visiting family or friends who needed a safe place to stay. It had a garden where Grace could play, a kitchen designed for actual cooking rather than catering elaborate dinner parties, and windows that looked out at the Pacific Ocean. It felt like home in a way that neither the Malibu mansion nor the Santa Monica showcase had ever felt. It was a place built for living rather than impressing, for safety rather than status, for genuine happiness rather than the appearance of success. Eleanor had officially retired, though she continued to serve on the Sterling Foundation's board of directors and occasionally took on pro bono cases for women escaping dangerous marriages. Her friendship with Victoria had deepened beyond the professional relationship they had inherited from Robert Chen's estate planning. Thomas had become the foundation's chief technology officer, using his cybersecurity expertise to help survivors hide their digital footprints from abusive partners and to assist law enforcement in tracking financial crimes. Miranda had completed her trauma therapy and had become one of the foundation's most effective victim advocates, using her personal experience with manipulation and coercion to help other women recognize the warning signs of dangerous relationships. The final scene of Victoria's transformation came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. She was loading Grace into her car seat, preparing for a trip to the grocery store, when she found herself checking the door handles out of instinct. But this time, she laughed at herself. They weren't locked. They never would be again. She tested the handles anyway, not from trauma, but from the fierce protectiveness of a mother who knew exactly how precious life was and how quickly it could be threatened by people who claimed to love you. Then she climbed into the driver's seat. She was always the driver now, and adjusted the rearview mirror. In the reflection, she saw Grace chattering happily in her car seat, surrounded by toys and books and all the beautiful detritus of a secure childhood. She saw herself, no longer the frightened woman who had escaped a burning car 3 years earlier, but someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than she had ever imagined possible. Victoria Sterling started the engine and drove toward the ocean, toward their everyday errands, toward the ordinary and extraordinary life they had built together. In her purse was a contract from a major publisher who wanted to help her write a book about her experience. On her phone were dozens of messages from other foundations wanting to partner with the Sterling organization. But today, she was just a mother taking her daughter to buy groceries, living the precious, mundane, completely free life that Bradford Sterling had tried to steal from them both. The sun was setting over the Pacific as they drove down the coastal highway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Grace tried to name from her car seat. The radio was playing something cheerful and forgettable. Traffic was light for a Thursday evening. It was perfect in its ordinariness. Victoria had learned the crucial difference between surviving and living. Surviving was escaping the burning car, exposing the fraud, sending Bradford to prison. Living was building something so beautiful and strong from the ashes of his destruction that his evil ultimately served the cause of good. She was no longer Bradford Sterling's victim, Bradford Sterling's wife, or even Bradford Sterling's survivor. She was Victoria Sterling, CEO of the Sterling Foundation, mother of Grace Eleanor Sterling, protector of other women who had faced similar monsters, and living proof that the worst thing that could happen to you might ultimately become the source of your greatest strength. The car moved smoothly down the familiar coastal road, carrying mother and daughter toward whatever came next. Victoria's hands rested confidently on the steering wheel. Grace's laughter filled the space between them, and the ocean stretched endlessly beside them, indifferent to human suffering, but somehow approving of human resilience. They were free. They were safe. They were exactly where they belonged, and they would never be trapped again. In the distance, the lights of other cars moved along the highway like stars, each one carrying someone toward their own destination, their own dreams, their own version of home. Victoria and Grace were part of that flow of ordinary life, no longer refugees from Bradford's violence, but participants in the beautiful, complex, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately hopeful human experience. Victoria Sterling had survived attempted murder and emerged as something her would-be killer had never anticipated: a woman who understood her own power and was willing to use it to protect others. The story that had begun with fire and terror had become something else entirely, a testament to the strength that could be forged from the worst betrayal, and proof that love, when it was real, was always stronger than the greed and cruelty that tried to destroy it. As they drove toward home, Grace fell asleep in her car seat, her small hand curled around a toy compass that always pointed toward true north. Victoria smiled and kept driving, following that same direction toward a future that belonged entirely to them. Victoria Sterling's story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments forge our greatest strength. From a woman trapped in a burning car to the CEO of a foundation protecting thousands of other women, her journey proves that survival isn't just about escaping danger. It's about building something so strong that danger can never touch you again. Bradford Sterling thought he was destroying a helpless victim. Instead, he created a warrior who would use his own stolen millions to ensure no other woman would suffer the same fate. If Victoria's story moved you, if it made you think about the signs we sometimes ignore, or if it reminded you that you're stronger than you know, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your own experiences, or simply let me know which part of her journey resonated most with you. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, if you want to support content that shines a light on difficult truths and celebrates human resilience, please consider hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these stories when they need them most. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because we have more incredible true stories coming your way. Stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when life pushed them to their breaking point. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes we don't know our own strength until someone else's story shows us what's possible. Until next time, remember your story isn't over, and sometimes the worst chapter becomes the turning point for the best one. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.